Hey, and welcome, Gurus, to the section conclusion of this section on NAT Gateway. I'm Chase, your Azure Training Architect, and in this section conclusion, we're going to use a case study scenario to remind ourselves about some of the things that we covered in this section. We'll review our virtual network NAT concepts, and we'll also review that demonstration we had on implementing virtual network NAT. So without further ado, let's take a look at our case study scenario for Control-Alt Suites, and exactly what we mean when we say review virtual network NAT concepts. What we're talking about when we're reviewing these concepts here are those concepts like SNAT for our outbound connections, the dynamic port address translation that takes place using NAT Gateway that maps those private IPs and ports to the public IP and port that is sent for outbound traffic communications from our NAT Gateway. And we're talking about the public endpoints for our NAT Gateway, such as those standard SKU public IPs or public IP prefixes, and the association of NAT Gateway and what resources it affects at the subnet level. Then we're going to talk about that review of the virtual NAT demonstration that we did, and we're going to use that to identify the current outbound IP mechanisms in place in Azure and talk about how we created our NAT Gateway in the same region as the VNet, configure the public endpoint via public IP or public IP prefix and associate with that with our subnet to verify that SNAT of those outbound connections. So for our case study scenario architecture here, for the first part, we have our virtual network. And inside of this virtual network, let's say we have a subnet. And this subnet has an application gateway where we are using this as a public endpoint with a public IP address. It is balancing traffic for resources that are off in, say, another subnet. Now, traffic inbound comes over this public IP for our application gateway. On the outbound, traffic also goes through the same public IP address for those resources that are in the backend behind this application gateway. And this would be the default behavior for source network address translation and snatting these outbound connections for those resources behind our application gateway. And using NAT Gateway with a public IP or public IP address prefix, we can associate it with the subnet and split up this inbound and outbound traffic so that outbound traffic coming out of those resources behind our application gateway is actually going to be sent via this NAT Gateway out to the internet. Now, at this point in this section, we're familiar with these concepts of altering the default NAT experience for outbound connections by using NAT Gateway and associating it and impacting those resources that exist in that subnet. Now let's review that demonstration that we talked about where we had our virtual network NAT Gateway that we implemented by creating that NAT Gateway and its public IP address and associating it with that subnet where our resource existed. Now, if you remember, we had that Bastion resource for our subnet, and we used that to access that virtual machine. And what we changed when we created that NAT Gateway and made that association was how outbound traffic would be routed to the internet. Rather than going via an ephemeral IP, as it did in our demonstration, once we created that NAT Gateway and made that association to the subnet, that virtual machine was communicating outbound to the internet via the NAT Gateway, as we saw by the public IP address when we were using our Bastion to access that VM. All right, Gurus, that covers everything that we went over in this section. Thanks so much for joining me in this section, and I look forward to seeing you in the next section.